Greetings, mortals. It is I, Remortis, bringing you yet another guide to Baldur's Gate 3. This time on the art of necromancy. Welcome to my Necronomicon. After this, you too shall master the Undead. We'll be going over the different classes that can fulfill and aid the Necromancer role. The Necromancer Wizard, the Spore Druid, and the Oathbreaker Paladin. And 3 other classes that can actually fulfill this role too. And all of which that can work extremely well in a party together. Unlike my previous guides, this one will be distributed in chapters, as there's a lot to cover here. We'll be going over the Necromancy spell list available in Baldur's Gate 3. We'll do an in-depth look at our most notorious spell, Animate Dead. We'll be going over each class that can wield necromancy and what unique ways they can go about it, as well as a guide on what to do in the early and mid-game, as this playstyle can be quite different than others, and you'll see why. But as for today's chapter, we'll just be going over the Necromancy spell list, with timestamps posted below so you can skip to whatever's relevant to you. Let us begin then, shall we? So you wish to master the dark arts of the undead? Very well, I shall share my knowledge with you. Necromancy deals with many facets of death, manipulating the energy that animates all living things, learning to sap the life force from a creature, or even restoring that essence into another. At one point, most healing magics were considered a form of necromancy. Communing with the dead, resurrection, and animation are all forms of necromantic magic. And without a doubt, necromancy is quite powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. In comparison to D&D 5th edition anyways, and we'll go over some of those details in a moment. And while we are able to drain the life force out of our foes, or inflict curses and other nasty effects, we are most notoriously known by our ability to raise undead minions. But before we dive into that, we should go over the basics of the Necromancy School of Magic, and the necromantic spells available to us in Baldur's Gate 3. For cantrips, we only have access to Bone Chill, which is a very solid cantrip to have. While it might not do the most damage compared to other cantrips such as Eldritch Blast and Firebolt, it still does a respectable 1d8 damage, upgrading to 2d8 at level 5 and 3d8 at level 10. It also prevents healing, which can be quite useful against a few encounters in the game, especially those that have regeneration of some sort, or perhaps they are humanoid targets who want to try and use potions to heal themselves. It will also cause undead targets to have disadvantage on their attack rolls, even if they're immune to the necrotic damage portion. This can be a useful trick to help inflict disadvantage on tougher undead foes. On to level 1 spells. We have a few to choose from in the various magical categories, starting with Inflict Wounds, that are only available to clerics and oathbreakers, which deals a hefty 3d10 necrotic damage and an additional 1d10 damage per spell level that you upcast it to. It's a close range spell, so be wary of that. It's a solid damaging spell should you need to use it, although I wouldn't use it higher than 2nd level, but you surely can in a pinch. For level 1 arcane spells, we have False Life that wizards, sorcerers, and warlocks can get access to, which simply grants 7 temporary hit points and 5 more per upcasted spell slot. If you want or need some temporary HP, you could go this route, but I would not waste a spell slot on it. Use scrolls or other means instead. And then we have Ray of Sickness, which deals 2d8 poison damage and 1d8 per upcasted spell slot, that can also poison the target if they fail their con save, which will give them disadvantage on their attack rolls. This can be a decent spell to use when combined with other poison-related items in the game. It's not an amazing spell by any stretch, but I wouldn't discount it either. On to level 2 spells, we have Blindness, which severely reduces a target's vision, and makes all attacks against it to have advantage. I personally would not use a spell slot on it, and I would use scrolls or other items to produce this effect instead. Or I would cast Darkness, which can cause AoE blindness. Ray of Enfeeblement is also an option, which causes a target to deal half damage with weapon attacks that rely on strength. So think of ogres and other larger monsters that typically rely on their strength. I don't really use this spell either, if I'm honest. But moving on to 3rd level spells, this is when necromancy begins to pop off, as they say. We get access to our most notorious spell, Animate Dead, which we will go over in its own chapter. We get access to Bestow Curse, which is a situational spell that grants a variety of curses on an opponent, ranging from imposing disadvantage on specific saves, causing an enemy to occasionally skip their turn, increasing the damage further spells or attacks can deal to it, Sadly, it does not apply to magic missiles, which is a shame. I don't typically use my spell slots on Bestow Curse either, but it can be a decent option if you really want to inflict some type of CC on an opponent with another character and you can help lower that saving throw, for example. Again, resort to items or scrolls to use this spell, in my opinion. Feign Death doesn't have many applications in Baldur's Gate 3. You put an ally into a protective coma that grants resistance to all damage types except psychic. But it also gives you immunity to poison and disease. I suppose you could fill a room or area with poison and want to avoid hitting an ally with it, so I guess you could use that spell then. But I think this spell is much more useful on tabletop. If there are instances where this spell is actually useful, please by all means enlighten me down in the comments section below. Next, we will be moving on to the more powerful level 3 spells, and what more powerful than Resurrection? More specifically, Revivify, which only clerics and paladins have access to. Although you should be familiar with it, as it is one of the more accepted spells in our repertoire, which resurrects an ally with 1 HP. And surely you'll come across plenty of scrolls of Revivify during your adventures. But once you learn this spell, you won't have to rely on those scrolls as much, except, maybe to resurrect the Resurrector. And you can help conserve those scrolls. Speak with the Dead is a fantastic ritual spell that can help you with problem solving. But you are limited to only 5 questions, but not every corpse has something useful or anything to say for that matter. Especially if you're the one that's slated. This can be resolved by disguising yourself, and then speaking to the dead. There are a variety of ways to be granted Speak with the Dead, and I would pursue those avenues instead of learning this spell when you level up. And finally, we get access to one of my favorite spells, Vampiric Touch, which deals 3d6 damage and 1d6 per upcasted spell slot, and heals you by half the amount of damage you've dealt. And you can keep casting this spell for free each turn, so long as you don't lose concentration on it. It does require you to be in melee range, however, and there are quite a few ways to make this spell more reliable to hit, which we'll go over in another chapter. But what a more iconic way of dealing with a target that is in your face by draining the life force and restoring your own in the process. Get out of my face. Blight is the only 4th level necromancy spell. It is available to druids, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, which is more or less a stronger version of Inflict Wounds, dealing 8d8 damage, or 8d64, and increases by 1d8 per upcasted spell slot. In comparison, Inflict Wounds will deal about 6 to 60 damage when using a 4th level spell slot, but Inflict Wounds is fairly comparable in terms of damage as you upcast it even further. The main difference that Blight has over Inflict Wounds is that it has a range of 9 meters, or 30 feet. And next, we will move on to the only 5th level necromancy spell castable by clerics and druids, Contagion, which inflicts a disease of your choice, ranging from okay inflictions to severely debilitating conditions, such as making a target vulnerable to every type of damage, or being stunned anytime it takes damage, or being befuddled, which makes the target wander around aimlessly, wasting its turn. And then on to level 6 spells with Circle of Death, castable by wizards, warlocks, and sorcerers, that deals 8d6 necrotic damage in a massive AoE radius. Its damage isn't too high, but scales very well with each level beyond 6. Sadly, we can only cast up to the 6th level spells in Baldur's Gate 3, so 8 to 48 damage is all we have at this time. Plus, there are also other higher damaging sources that we can deal instead of this spell. It's still a decent spell for how wide it hits though. We can also cast Create Undead, available to clerics, wizards, and warlocks, which will allow us to create a mummy, which has 93 hit points, an AC of 18, resistance to necrotic and poison damage, while being vulnerable to fire damage. Radiant attacks are neutral against it, which is something to consider if you ever encounter one in the wild. Its melee attack deals 8 to 33 damage, or 2d6 plus 3 bludgeoning, and 3d6 necrotic. That also inflicts a condition called Mummy Rot, which is a curse that reduces the target's maximum hit points by 8 and prevents healing. Mummies also get a multi-attack that deal a whopping 16 to 66 damage, aka 2 melee attacks, both of which will apply Mummy Rot if they're hit. But the target must be frightened in order to be able to use the multi-hit. And luckily for the mummy, they get an ability to inflict the frightened condition on a target, which will enable that multi-attack. The mummy's a decent undead unit that is mostly useful to prevent the target from healing. And then lastly, we have the spell Harm, which is only available to clerics, that deals an incredible 14 to 84 damage and reduces the target's maximum hit points by that same amount, unless it succeeds its save. In comparison to Inflict Wounds, Cast at level 6, it'll do 8 to 80 damage, although harm can be cast at a decent range. So as you can see, necromancy spells can deal some decent damage, or inflict some nasty conditions. Although our most infamous and quintessential aspect of necromancy is raising the dead, particularly with the great spell, Animate Dead. And that concludes this chapter of the Necronomicon. For now, anyways. There is still plenty to go over, but I imagine I've exhausted what limited attention you could spare. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you'd like to see more guides like these, or tell me how wrong I am regarding these spells. Either way, thank you for watching, or more likely, listening, and I hope to see you in the next chapter of the Necronomicon, Animating the Dead. Farewell for now.